Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is failure. I'm really excited to talk about this morning with you because there's a revelation available. So if you've ever had fear of failure or haven't done something because you might fail or feel like you're a failure, this conversation is something you shouldn't miss. But before we get started, let's just take a couple minutes to settle in and get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing your cells, nourishing your organs. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, any stress, toxicity, negativity. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, bringing energy and vitality and lightness of spirit into all aspects of your being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, any stress, negativity, any remaining fatigue. And now let's just gently press our palms together. Softly, softly rub your fingers against your palms. Feel that wonderful sensation, the tickling and tingling of that sensation, and bring yourselves present right here, right now. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm really excited about this topic. Yesterday, I was talking with a client and they were talking about shifting their relationship with failure. And we had this most remarkable conversation. Fear of failure is something that plagues so many people and keeps us from experimenting in life. It keeps us from exploring because we're afraid we'll fail, or keeps us from chasing or following our dreams because we're afraid we'll fail. And some of us have tried things and not succeeded in the objectives that we had hoped to achieve in the past, and then identify with being a failure. And so and I can relate to that personally. That was a big part of my persona, so to speak, for a lot of my life, is just believing that I was a failure. And so in this conversation, it was really interesting because I asked, what would it look like to shift your relationship with failure? And then through the conversation, I asked the surprisingly obvious, yet really profound question: define failure. And the thing that happened was that this person was unable to define failure. And when we get specific, what actually is failure? Failure is when it's constrained by a very specific context. So for instance, if I am running a race and my intention is to place first in the race, and I don't place first in the race, then what happened was I failed to meet that very specific objective that was defined by first place and defined by that specific race. Okay, so I failed to meet that objective. The fact of the matter is that failure actually is very tied to context. Good morning, Rosalind. Tuning into the M&M show, Maggie and Mira and Maggie, and she's here. Here she is. Say hi, Maggie. Everybody wants to see you and say hello. Good morning. Now she's playing with all kinds of toys. I have this standing desk that changes elevation. So the desk is high and she's underneath the desk, and there are pens and papers and things that she enjoys dropping on the floor and chewing on. So that's what she's been doing a lot this morning. Anyway, so we're talking about failure. And this is actually a revelation to recognize that failure is always defined, actual failure is always, and I don't use that often, that word that much, defined by a constraint. And it's a specific constraint. So I gave you the example of the race. And let's say I say that I am going to do, I'm going to, a lot of people have issues around weight. So let's say I'm going to lose 5 pounds by the end of the month. Okay. And so I set that intention, I set that expectation, and the end of the month comes and I haven't lost the 5 pounds. So what I get to say is I failed to lose the 5 pounds, not I'm a failure. I get to say, okay, in this objective, I failed to lose the 5 pounds, and now I can create a new context if that's still an objective that I'm committed to. Good morning, Tammy. Maggie is here. She's just wandering around out of view of the camera. She'll show up eventually, I'm sure. So this idea of failure is feedback. Success is feedback. It's not a state of being. You know, it's not intended to be a state of being, but we often translate it into that. So let's see. Another aspect of failure is, let's say, I expect myself to be able to wake up at every morning by 5 a.m. and meditate for an hour and follow this other protocol. And I don't do that today, and I don't do that the next day, and I don't do that the next day. Does that mean I'm a failure? No, it means that I failed on this particular day to meet that particular expectation. And what we get to do is create a new context. Perhaps that is a context or an expectation that we're not truly aligned with to begin with. And so we get to evaluate and recreate a context that perhaps is more workable for ourselves. So this translation to failure as a state of being, if you really go and look at what that means, what does it mean? The simple and incredibly powerful question, what is the definition of failure? If you look in yourself, if that's an issue for you, you may find a challenge finding a definition. Because what happened was this client said, you know what, I don't know how to define it. But it was a sense, it was a felt sense of having experienced failure. And when we recreate this conversation about failure to be one of context that is very specific, and then we have the capacity more readily to understand that failure is feedback. So for instance, let's say I'm trying to invent something. And think about Thomas Edison, who tried supposedly more than 200 times, or maybe way more than that, to invent a light bulb. And so time one, did he create a working light bulb? No. So the feedback is this collection of steps that I took to develop this working light bulb didn't work. So now I see that it failed to create the result that I was going for. Now I get to create a new context, perhaps new parameters on how I'm going to develop this light bulb. Good morning, Suzanne. Thank you so much for joining us. We're talking about failure this morning and how the reason that failure holds sway for us so powerfully is that we actually don't define it. And if we do define it, we probably don't define it with accuracy. And I believe that an accurate definition of failure is feedback that tells us that we failed to meet the constraints of a particular context or expectation. So when we constrain our awareness of failure to that definition, all of a sudden there's the judgment shifts. So let's say I have a certain expectation of myself to behave in a certain way in response to certain circumstances. Notice that in my setup for this example, I'm saying behave a certain way. There's a context in a certain set of circumstances, okay, which is again context. It's a narrow definition. So let's say I'm in an interaction and I expect myself to be able to maintain a state of cool and calm collectedness. And let's say I react and I get upset. So I can say that I failed to meet the expectation that I would stay cool, calm, and collected. However, I can also look at that same situation that failed to meet that specific constraint or that specific objective that failed, and what succeeded. What succeeded is maybe I learned something new about myself. Maybe I learned that going into a situation without first taking a deep breath and centering myself didn't work very well. Maybe I can create a new context to say, okay, what did I learn from this? How can I take what I learned, the feedback that was successful, anything I learned is successful, take the feedback that I got and use that in the next iteration, the next opportunity for maybe a similar interaction or a different interaction. So for instance, let's say I'm playing a tennis match and I lose that match. Okay, so I failed to win that match. It doesn't make me a failure. I failed to win that specific match. And the likelihood is that I learned a ton if I allow myself to go in and look at, well, what did I learn? What's the feedback that I got from that other than what I didn't work? If I go back in, I can look at, well, what did work? Or what did I observe that I can respond to in a different way come next time? What can I learn about maybe how to adjust my serve or how this other player plays so that when I create the new context for the next task or the next context, I'll be better prepared potentially. So if you're making 200 or more iterations to develop a light bulb, each one of those in each one of those interim modifications makes an adjustment. And so, Davey, this isn't an appropriate context for that conversation, so I'm not even going to speak it. This is right now we're talking about failure and the meaning of failure and how we have taken on the identity of failure and the experience of failure as something devastating, like it means something about our character. And the fact is, it doesn't. Failure itself is something that is defined within a specific constraint, a specific perspective, a specific mode of measurement. And I'm wondering if this is creating an opening for you as you're engaging in this conversation with me, because it's really powerful. Because I growing up, I told you I really experienced being a failure, And a lot of that came from failing to meet the expectations of my parents, that often weren't even clear to me, right? So all I knew is that they weren't happy with this, that, or the other thing, but I didn't know why, and I didn't know specifically which this, that, or the other things they were not so happy with. So I'm wondering how you now think about this notion of failure. What does it mean? What does it mean to you? How has it shown up in your life? Has the fear of failure stopped you from doing things that you felt called to do, or that you dreamt of doing, or that you desired to do? I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to be any good at it. Well, so the thing is that how do we get good at things? We practice and we learn from the feedback, right? So if I'm learning to play piano and I notice that I have this certain pattern that is making it hard for me to, or I notice that I'm having trouble doing scales or doing chords, or, doing a certain piece of, or playing this certain piece of music, rather than getting upset every time I make an error, I use that as feedback to say, okay, what can I do differently? So failure as feedback, and failure as finite. So it's failure is bounded. Just remember this, and let's integrate this. Let's metabolize this so that we really get it in our bones. Failure is always finite. By definition, it is constrained by a certain specific set of expectations or parameters. So just because I failed in this particular quest, whatever that is, doesn't mean I am a failure. It means I then get to create a new context for the next objective. And in fact, I can reframe that situation where I am the failure, or I experience the failure, not where I am the failure. I don't need to take that on. I can reframe that to look at what are the gains. So what was I successful at? I was successful at finding a new way not to create a light bulb, for example. So Suzanne says, if I fail, it gets me down for a bit, but then I will try again. I'm pretty resilient. So Suzanne, what I suggest is that it could be really interesting to look at when you fail, and I'm putting that in air quotes, when you fail, to look at what was the expectation. What was the expectation that you had for yourself? And then what is the judgment around that lack of fulfilling the expectation? So I think that if we recognize that this notion of failure, again, is contextual and bounded, very, very specifically bounded, then we can redefine the parameters. Okay, so Rosalind says, I try not to let my dad's judgment cause me distress. He thinks that because I don't have kids, that my life is a waste, failure. Wow. Life is a waste were his words. Wow, Rosalind, I don't have kids either. And so the thing that you get to, and this is huge, because parental judgment is what we grow up under, the cloud or the rainbow of it. And when parental judgment is saying life is a waste, or your life is a waste because you don't have kids, what is happening is that your dad is really just talking about his own determination of what life is for. And you and I obviously don't believe that life is about having kids. That maybe life, certainly I'm taking a flyer here, but I am guessing that life has much more meaning for you than simply something about having children. That you have vast other meanings that you attribute to life. And if the meaning of life is simply to procreate, um, then I just kind of consider that as a narrow view. There's a whole lot more to life than procreating. So I get that we want our parents' approval. However, you don't need to take on his very limited view of what makes life worthwhile. And I'm so sorry to hear that you're at the effect of that. That's uh, I'm just sorry that I'm sorry that you've had to endure that, and I hope that you can separate your life from his, that his judgment really is about him. It has not a thing to do with you and your value on the planet. None. It has nothing to do with it. And I realized how impactful, despite that his judgment has nothing to do with you and your value. I realized that that's a hard thing to grow up with. And I'm so sorry for that. And Suzanne says, my dad always thought I wasn't successful in enough in life, like career. Again, father judgment, Suzanne, right? So just because you're not meeting his particular constraints, you're not meeting his particular values, like maybe he thinks you need to make X amount of money in order to be successful. Maybe he doesn't value well-being. Maybe he doesn't value joy or happiness. Maybe his perspective on life is really rooted around money or specific achievement. It's not, so that's like an overarching judgment. And I wonder, Suzanne, what would happen if you would say, what would it look like to be successful to you? What does success mean to you? And Rosalind, I wonder if it would make any, if it would add any insight to say to your father, is that the only, is having children the only thing that makes life worthwhile? It may be that that judgment from him is coming from a very archaic notion of what makes a woman's life valuable, Rosalind. And that may be um, an underlying prejudice that your dad has. Rosalind says the new context, or reframing the absence of biological kids, could be redirected to adoption if that's a desire down the road. So I think, Rosalind, it's really, really important for you to think about whether you hold the same value about children that your father does. And maybe you want to be having that conversation with him. So Rosalind says, I think my dad was talking about having children in terms of leaving some kind of legacy. So that gets down to the point, and that's awesome, because there are all kinds of ways that we can leave a legacy. And is a legacy leaving our genetics on the planet, or is a legacy leaving an imprint of goodness with the people that you have engaged with in your life, Is it a legacy of giving? Is it a legacy of the kinds of projects that you supported in your life? Is it a trust, a fund, or a charity? I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we can leave a legacy, if it's important to leave a legacy at all. So that's a conversation that I think is important. One of I've spoken about this vision that I have of an eco park, and how it will be an education and enlightenment center, so to speak, for sustainability. And people have said to me, "Oh, what a wonderful legacy!" And I think that we can leave a legacy like that. I'm not pursuing that as a legacy. I'm pursuing it because I think it's something that's needed on the planet. But if legacy is important, there are multitudes of ways to leave a legacy. And Suzanne says the success was measured on success in career or society. So the thing about what you're saying, Suzanne, is success in career or society is very ambiguous. And what does success mean? Does it mean making X number of dollars a year? Does it mean having certain recognition in society or culture? What does it mean? What specifically does it look like? Because there's no way that any of us can reach an objective if we don't know what it is or what direction it's in. And so by saying success in career or society, that is a very relative thing. What does it mean? Does it mean having 1.5 kids, a white picket fence, a dog, and what is that success? Is success making $1 million? Is success finding happiness and joy in life? Is success being self-expressed? What is success? So Suzanne says, yes, titles like being a doctor. Well, it's interesting, what is it about the title of being a doctor that means success? Because there are doctors or people who have achieved MDs who are working at Starbucks. So what does that mean in terms of success? So it would probably, if you don't already know, Suzanne, it might be interesting to have that conversation with your dad. Like, what's in a title? What's in a title? If you have the title of doctor, what's in that is that you've had that you've gone through school and you've achieved certain markers and you've succeeded at getting that academic recognition or degree, right? But what does it mean? Because there are doctors that choose to practice with populations where they're not getting paid, they don't make very much money, and there are doctors that make a fortune, but they are not really they're not doing much of a social contribution. So Suzanne, I see that you said he passed. So you get to have these conversations with yourself, or you can imagine yourself having the conversations with your dad, because carrying this judgment of his about you somehow in your being is not is probably not supporting you in your greatest expression in the world. That's my guess. That there is a way that you can start looking more deeply into, first of all, recognizing that this was his judgment. This was his judgment. And for me, my being a failure was a result of my interaction with my parents and these undefined expectations that I really didn't I didn't know what they were, but I know I didn't meet them. So there was this sense of disappointment that registered very deeply for me, because I wasn't meeting these expectations. I wasn't a cheerleader. I wasn't, any number of other things. And therefore, because I wasn't those things, I was a failure. Rather than looking at, well, wait a second, what are the expectations that those people are placing on me, and then using as a criteria by which to judge me or my performance. So once we can tease this apart and recognize that there are that failure has a very specific constraint, and where we start experiencing failure and where it becomes tyrannical for us is when it's generalized. When it's generalized beyond the actual constraint that it is relating to, when it becomes generalized, like, I'm a failure because I didn't achieve this objective that so and so had for me. And we don't even know what's beyond the title, because I'll tell you what, um, you could be a doctor of philosophy, you could be a doctor of neuroscience. Would your father, for instance, value both of those titles equally? Well, I'm guessing that he probably wouldn't, but I don't know. And so realize that other people's judgments of us are something that we get to evaluate to determine whether we actually are going to receive and take ownership of those values and judgments. And usually when we receive those judgments, we just receive them, especially as children, right? We just receive them. We don't evaluate, wait a second, what is the criteria that this person is using? And is that criteria that I actually accept? Do I validate that for myself? So I think this is such an important and big conversation, because so much of our upbringing and our lives really are programmed by the environment in which we are raised, the values and the ideas and the judgments that are part of our day-to-day experience, and then by media and institutions that we're told what to value. And these are things that we never question. And what I'm suggesting here is to dive, especially around this idea of failure and success, to recognize success also, by the way, is contextual. It is contextual, because somebody could be a tremendously successful business person. First of all, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a successful business person? That's a general statement. Is it based on the amount of money they made? Is it based upon the social contribution that their business is making? What is success measured by? And then they could be a tremendously successful business person, but a disaster when it comes to their marriage, or their relationships with people and the way that they treat people in the world. So they could be a horrific disaster when it comes to maybe they're unsuccessful at finding peace, or maybe they're unsuccessful at expressing kindness to people in the world. So again, this whole notion of success and failure is literally black and white, is literally constrained by very specific parameters that we very rarely explore or question. And as soon as we do, it falls apart. because while my client and I were talking about failure, as if we both knew what we were talking about, we could have this conversation. But the thing is that when we went to find the definition of it, it the revelation that the notion of failure was rather amorphous until we really dug in, exposed the fact that this idea of success and failure is something that we have generalized in such a way that it makes it unachievable. Like it makes success unachievable, um, and failure actually is actually it's as if we're using the constraints, failure is achievable, success is achievable, but without recognizing the constraints, it's just amorphous. Dido says it reminds me of how shame is defined. It's an overgeneralization to think that we were overall bad or a failure. Exactly. You can't be a failure, yet you can take on the persona of that, and that is a self-perpetuating experience, instead of looking at specific situations that have shown up in our lives. Exactly. So, for instance, I had a restaurant and years and years ago, and it failed. What did it failed because I ended up having to close it, and I went out of business. So does that mean that every part of the restaurant was a failure? Does it mean that every day in the restaurant was a failure? Does it mean because I failed at having a restaurant that stayed open that maybe ultimately I could sell or something, does that mean I'm a failure? It means that venture failed as far as making a viable business. There are lots of other areas in which that venture was successful. Rosalind says, I like what you said, Mira. We don't have to adopt those judgments, not to validate them. I have to rewatch the video because you didn't use the word adopt. The word you used instead was perfect. So hoping I can go back and jot down the exact phrase you said. I think, I don't know what the exact word was, Rosalind, but it might have been internalized. We don't have to accept. We don't have to receive those values. What we do get to do is to bring them to awareness and evaluate them, and to see if they are in alignment with our own perspective and our own vantage point. And I think the thing is, with judgments such as success and failure and the attendant guilt and shame and blame that goes along with all of that, is something that warrants our greater awareness, our greater attention, and inquiry, for real. And Rosalind, thank you. I love that you're taking notes. That's pretty amazing. So I feel honored about that. So anyway, I think that that's it for the day, for today. But I just found this such a really, really important revelation. So important that I'm in the process of putting together a course, and this is definitely going to be part of it, because it's something that so many of us torture ourselves with, is this whole notion of success and failure. And a lot of the societal cultural definitions relating to success and failure are actually pretty bogus, and based on some very superficial values that deserve to be challenged. So with that, I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. This is Maggie, who is just eating me up today, literally. And we go live every weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page. It is such a pleasure and privilege to be with you guys and to have these conversations. Please check out the wonderful programming and community on Enlightened World Network. And until next time, take a look for yourself at the things, at the ways in which you've judged yourself to have failed or be a failure, and dig a bit more deeply, recognize the constraints within which that feedback is evaluated, and perhaps you'll find some greater freedom for yourself. So until next time, lots and lots of love.